pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1714 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, and none other than the well-known history professor from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, right there on the banks of the great Monongahela River. That is Professor Bob Rodrigues. He's going to continue his presentations on the Vietnam War. Specifically in this and the next episode, he's going to be talking about the escalation of the war as the United States got deeper and deeper into the tar pit of Vietnam. He's going to start off in 1966 when LBJ made a very momentous speech to the nation. He's going to end this episode in 1967, when Martin Luther King made a very dramatic speech to the nation. Keep in mind now, Dr. Bob is a renowned history professor. He's going to be giving us some very good information. You are highly encouraged to have pen and paper nearby, or whatever device you use to record important information, because he's going to be giving you lots of it. Also, I'd like to encourage you to clear out anything that might interfere with your reception of Dr. Bob's presentation. Turn off the radio, turn off the TV, turn off all your other devices, turn off your game console. Run all the loudmouth people out of the room so you can have some peace and quiet and take in everything Dr. Bob is going to tell you about. Without any further ado, Dr. Bob, the microphone is all yours.
Hi, Mac. Good to be back. And we're going to resume our story of the Vietnam War, and we're going to lead where we left off in January of 1966 when Lyndon Johnson delivered his speech of commitment, in which he determined that the United States would continue their commitment in Vietnam to support South Vietnam against the Viet Cong insurgents and the North Vietnamese communists. So in 1966 February, Johnson is going to fly to Hawaii to meet the president of South Vietnam, Nguyen Cao Ky. Now, Nguyen Cao Ky was a flamboyant Air Force pilot who actually reluctantly took over the job as president of South Vietnam. But what Johnson did there is he reasserted his commitment to help the South Vietnamese government in their fight against communism. So to Ky, this was a good pledge. This was a pledge of continued American support. It was very clear to the South Vietnamese that if they did not have this support from the United States, they would not be able to continue to fight in the Vietnam War. Now, in April of 1966, the United States B-52s begin to pound North Vietnam to disrupt movement along the Mua Gia Pass. That's M-U-G-I-A. This was a pass that's connected up with the Ho Chi Minh Trail from North Vietnam via Laos. And this became the main route in which the NVA began to send personnel, supplies down into South Vietnam. So our strategy was to bomb that pass and hopefully interdict this supply. This was interdiction bombing. In other words, to cut the supply. This is as opposed to carpet bombing, which is more done to intimidate or to put fear into the inhabitants and just create general destruction. Now, also by 1966, June, the bombing of Hanoi began by American bombers. The NVA were moving into South Vietnam, so what we thought we would do is put pressure on Hanoi. Now, in putting pressure on Hanoi, we were clearly wearing down the residents, okay? And this was a highly populated area of North Vietnam, between Hanoi and Haiphong, the port harbors. This is where the main body of the North Vietnamese population lived, and of course the peasants were spread throughout the land. But what this did is this really increased the resolve of the North Vietnamese civilians. They created civil defense, air raid, bomb shelters in their fight to defend themselves against the American bombing attacks. In the meantime, the NVA had moved into the DMZ. Now, the DMZ was the demilitarized zone, and it was centered around the 17th parallel. Now, the DMZ was about 160 miles long. It went from Laos to the South China Sea, and it was 8 miles on either side of the Ben Hai River. Okay, the Ben Hai River flowed inside the DMZ, and if you would go 8 miles to the north of it and 8 miles to the south of it, that pretty much comprised the DMZ. Okay. Now, the DMZ is what it says it is. It's a demilitarized zone. However, we know that the NVA now began to work in the DMZ in order to continue their movement down into South Vietnam. In January of 1967, Lyndon Johnson, in a nationwide speech, requests a 6% income tax surcharge to finance a U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Well, needless to say, this did not go over too well with the populace. What Johnson tried to sell the citizenry on was the fact that it amounted to about $5 a month for most families, and in some cases, it was less than $5 a month. Now, of course, keep in mind this was 1967 money, not the money of 2020. It could certainly buy a lot more. $5 could buy a lot more in 1967. He also brought out the point that when he became president, that for the full year in 1964, he had created a tax cut. And what he was asking now was for 1/4 of that tax cut to be given back to the federal government so that they could prosecute and finance U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The Congress, the Constitution of Congress had changed in the mid-year elections of 1966, and the Democrats had lost some seats in the House and in the Senate. They still held both houses of Congress. But what you had was about a year's delay before the surcharge was passed. Now, this is an indication, number one, that we are beginning to drag our feet, at least congressionally, regarding the Vietnam War. And the fact that now it was beginning to hit directly into the pockets of American citizens drew awareness. The fact that this conflict in Southeast Asia was now beginning to cost money. Keep in mind, in 1965, when the United States began to become involved in Vietnam in a more certain manner, other than advisors, the Vietnam story was still on the back pages of the newspapers. There were much more pressing areas of the world, like the Middle East and in Korea, that had been a little bit more prominent. But Vietnam was in the back. But by 65, when we begin to draft troops into the Army, and now by 66, 67, begin to ask for an increase in money, income tax, to support the war, the awareness among the American people is going to grow more acute. January of 67 as well, the United States is going to launch a military operation known as Cedar Falls. Now, Cedar Falls was a search and destroy mission to attempt to destroy the Iron Triangle, which was an area northwest of Saigon that was a major Viet Cong stronghold. Now, this had some very determined fighting, and it was pretty much conducted by Marine units in the area. And what resulted was there were some events where American Marines went into villages that had snipers and had attacks leveled on them, and they began to clear out the area, and in many cases it appeared to be what you would fall under the category of atrocity, although in war it is hard to define atrocity. War in itself is an atrocity. But there was some ill feeling brought out after that operation toward the American military, at least in that area. And then this is going to spread more widely throughout South Vietnam. Later that month, actually into February, the United States launched the largest airborne operation probably since World War II, although there was a large Korean operation in 1950. This was called Operation Junction City. It was an 82-day military operation, started in February and ended in May. Now, the objective of this operation was to identify and find the Central Office of South Vietnam, COSVN. This was supposedly the brain trust of the Viet Cong or the National Liberation Front. You know, we, from a Western point of view, perspective, we saw this as a mini Pentagon. We even kind of visualized it as having stenographers and secretaries and typists and so on in the conduct of the war, in supporting the conduct of the war. So what our design was to seek this out and destroy it. Well, the operation, as we said, went on for months, and the so-called mini Pentagon of the Central Office of South Vietnam was never located. We found out later that there was no such entity. What they did have was a moving Central Office of South Vietnam, meaning this was not temporary. They moved about. It was a very mobile unit, and not in the Western thought of it being a, quote, Pentagon, a brain trust area. So later that year, in March of 1967, the Secretary General for the United Nations is going to make a proposal for peace. His name was U Thant, okay? U and then Thant. Now, what U Thant was doing, by the way, he was from Thailand, and he was the Secretary General of the UN. He was also doing was really reflecting the common thinking among many of the Western nations who were allies of the United States, such as the United Kingdom, France, West Germany, Canada, etc. And basically what they were trying to communicate to the United States was that they should stop prosecuting the war in Southeast Asia. There was a double fear there, and the first fear, of course, that this would expand into a larger Cold War corruption. And the loom of nuclear war always loomed overhead. It was there with dark clouds, so to speak. And the second was that the United States was beginning to develop a reputation as an aggressor in Vietnam. They were almost looked upon as the bad guys. So Utah is going to make that appeal in March. In April 4th to be exact, Dr. Martin Luther King is going to deliver a sermon at the Riverside Church in New York City. In this, he calls the United States, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And he encourages draft evasion and suggests a merger between the civil rights and anti-war groups. Now, this is the first time that Dr. Martin Luther King spoken out against the Vietnam War. Up to now, he had been participatory in the sense that he was trying to advance his civil rights movement, and he did not want to be an abrasion to the government, to the United States government, and particularly to Johnson, who had signed the Civil Rights Act into place. But at this particular sermon, he delivers a warning, and a lot has to do with the fact that he began to see that there was a greater proportion of African American boys coming home in body bags.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Dr. Bob, we're going to take a little break in your presentation now and continue in the next episode where you're going to let us hear exactly what Martin Luther King said at that speech back on April the 4th of 1967. Ironically, 1 year to the day before he was assassinated. It was a terrible thing for this country. Can't wait to hear that part of your presentation on the escalation of the Vietnam War. This is Mac Payne here, closing out episode 1714 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you again for coming to listen to these stories, and you are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?